You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Part 3. Needless to say, after the awful nightmare that had happened Christmas night, and knowing now that I had made it so awful by writing in the journal, I decided at first that I was done communicating, or even trying to communicate with it. Whatever that monstrous, sentient swarm monster was, I had absolutely no desire to give it any further accidental inspiration. As such, as soon as my parents were up and wouldn't ask what I was doing out of bed, I took the journal outside to the garbage can and left it there. That night it was back at my bedside. I told myself that perhaps my parents had found it and thought I'd thrown it out by mistake, but some part of me knew better. Nevertheless, I shut it up in a drawer and refused to look at it, even as more and more nightmares assailed me, showing the sad boy being flayed, cooked, and tramped behind glass, wordlessly screaming for help. I'd gone over the date when the garbage truck would next visit so frantically that it was practically buried into my brain. When he finally arrived and I bounded out of the house and handed him the dream journal as if it were a bomb, he must have been surprised and puzzled, but he took it anyway. I only wish I was surprised when once more it was at my bedside. Surprised or no, I cried myself to sleep that night, and cried even harder after waking up from a nightmare in which the buzzing swarm creature threw the sad boy into a bottomless pit. Why me? Why? The next day, I finally plucked up the courage to look at the journal. It was just about as bad as I expected. I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. Why won't you help me? This must make you happy. You're a monster. Let me out. 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 This last line was repeated so many times, it took up nearly a full page on its own. Not knowing what else to do, I took my pen and decided that if I wrote a more lengthy passage, it would be harder for the monster to manipulate it into a license for torture. I don't want to hurt you, I wrote. The monster makes me. It doesn't make me happy at all. How can I help you? The nightmare I had the following night showed me what a mistake this was. I found my arms transformed into giant saws, and I was forced to hug the sad boy again and again while ritualistically repeating, I want to hurt you, it makes me happy. Then the monster forced me to cut out the sad boy's guts again, while making me ritualistically repeat the how from my last sentence, laughing all the time. Another I hate you letter, and I'd worked out that length clearly wasn't my friend. The monster in my dream could stitch my words together into the opposite of what I meant. Clearly there was only one thing to do. Write a short phrase in broken English that included words that couldn't be strung together without ceasing to make sense altogether. This is what I came up with. I help boy. And it was with those 3 words that I finally made a breakthrough. My nightmare that night was more in line with what my dreams had been like before the introduction of the dream journal. I found myself in a vast, dark, misty landscape filled with twisted, rotting trees, where the sky held no stars or moon. It was only by virtue of some sort of low-light vision that my mind conjured up that I was able to see anything at all. In the distance, I could see a figure struggling desperately to get away from something. I moved closer and saw that, unsurprisingly, it was the sad boy. But he wasn't trying to escape the bug monster. He was trapped in the branches of one of the trees, which was holding on to him like a cat that's caught a mouse. The mist, meanwhile, was winding up his legs slowly, like a snake moving in for the kill. When the sad boy saw me, he screamed and struggled even more, and given what I'd done before, his words weren't particularly unsurprising. "No! No, not you! Go away! Leave me alone!" I moved closer and opened my mouth. My broken phrase came out unaltered. "I help boy." The sad boy looked at me in shock, and I could see a gleam of hope in his eyes. I shut my mouth and opened it again. "I help boy." The sad boy was still staring. His lips trembled, and he asked softly, "You don't want to hurt me?" I opened my mouth again. "I help boy." "Then why did you hurt me?" I couldn't answer that with my one catchphrase, so instead I used one arm to grab another and jerked it up and down in pantomime. The sad boy seemed to understand what I was trying to say. "It makes you?" he asked, with wide, tear-filled, terrified eyes. I nodded and opened my mouth again. "I help boy." I began to cry again, this time in great, gulping sobs. I, however, wasn't prepared to let this go on too long. The tree was pulling him closer with every tear, so I reached out and grabbed his arms and pulled with all my might against the tree holding him. The tree tried to fight at first, but when he joined in my efforts, it seemed to decide this was a piece of prey not worth catching, and retracted its branches. The mist, meanwhile, skidded away from both of us, and the sad boy fell face forward onto the ground. After we'd sat up and dusted ourselves off, I pointed at him and made a confused gesture. He seemed to understand what I meant and wiped his nose before answering. "My name's Barney. What's yours?" I reached down into the dirt and wrote Emma with my finger. He almost looked happy. "Emma, that's pretty. How did you get into my dream?" I couldn't answer that either. I thought about how to pantomime my answer and eventually pointed at him, then tapped my own head before making a sign of going to sleep. His eyes widened. "I'm in your dream?" "Nod." "Are you one of the orphanage girls?" I shook my head and made a confused gesture. "Orphanage? What orphanage?" I hadn't heard of any orphanage. He looked confused. "Did the monster knock you out too?" I involuntarily shuddered at the thought of what this might imply, but shook my head. He seemed to accept this. "I guess I knew that. You're not always here the way it is." I raised an eyebrow, then gestured around me in confusion, trying to get across that it wasn't here now. He leaned in and whispered something to me that made my blood freeze. "It's all around us. We're inside it. It's listening." So that was why it was so dark. The thought made me shake with disgust and terror, and I felt tears start to roll down my cheeks. Barney, as I now knew the sad boy to be called, reached out and wiped them away. "Don't give it what it wants," he said. "It gets that enough from me." My lip was still quivering, but I nodded bravely, then opened my mouth again and tried to put as much of a questioning tone into my catchphrase. "I help boy?" He looked at me quizzically for a few moments, then his face pricked up in recognition. "You want to know how to help me?" he asked. Somehow his voice sounded more adult when he said it. Enthusiastic nod. Barney grinned for a moment, but it was a very short moment. His face went deadly serious and only got more so the longer he looked at me. Then he leaned in and whispered something truly terrible in my ear. "Kill me." I gaped at him, made several horrified hand gestures, then pointed at his stomach and grabbed my arm, pantomiming the stabbing I'd already done. He shook his head sadly at this last. Not here, he said fiercely. I won't die here. You have to. His face suddenly twisted into a mask of agony, then his head jerked unnaturally, and a horrible, leering smile spread over his face. You have to hurt me. A buzzing, malicious, hateful voice rasped from his throat. Hurt me till I can't take it here. Hurt me and you'll stop dreaming about me. I promise. I shook my head, and in a show of defiance, I opened my mouth and shouted, I help boy! That horrid, bullet rasp of a voice cackled with malicious glee. You can't get rid of me, it exulted. I'm part of him. I help boy! Yes, you help boy. That hideous voice snarled as the scene suddenly changed, and Barney was once more bound, gagged and tied to his bed. You help boy get rid of his liver this time. But I didn't give it the chance. Before I knew what was happening, I shoved the knife that appeared in my hand into my eye. There was a blinding moment of pure pain, and I woke up in my bed. However, in the moment just before the knife went into my eye, a sudden moment of recognition dawned on me as I stared around the room where Barney's bondage-laden bed sat. It was shabbier, dustier, and more sparsely furnished, but it was indubitable. Barney's bed was sitting in roughly the same place my bed was, and the room the creature had made me torture him in was my room. The next day I told my parents, on no uncertain terms, that I wanted a different room, that I thought it might make my nightmares go away. They seemed puzzled, but they told the servants to move my bed in with my sister Grace, who seemed absolutely delighted to have a playmate living with her full time. And I didn't mind being that playmate, because as it turns out, I was absolutely right. Once I was out of my old room, the nightmares stopped. Just to be safe, though, I locked my dream journal in my old bedside cabinet and resolved never to look at it again after that final night. You can probably guess what the final line was. Kill me! I never forgot that line, nor did I forget poor, sad Barney. And as you'll see, though it took me a while, I've done something about it.